Many worked as coolies for the Kwantung Occupation Army.
In a remote area, some Chinese were doing roadworks. They escaped, but some Japanese soldiers caught them and tortured them, kicking and beating them in front of us. We were 15 or 16 years old. Those elderly Chinese men weren't young enough to be spies or anything like that. I was watching and wondering why they were doing such violent things to the Chinese people. Reflecting back, we used to think that the Japanese were a superior race. Chinese and Koreans were lower class. Even in our pioneer group, some of them despised the Chinese. We all did.
Japan's military elite now controlled foreign policy. By law, the army and the navy enjoyed direct access to the emperor and effective independence of the government. The army was deeply conservative, suspicious of political parties, academic freedom, disarmament, and the West. Many middle-ranking officers joined ultra-nationalist groups demanding colonial expansion. Civilian government gradually collapsed. In a 6-year period, the army forced 3 prime ministers out of office. 2 more were assassinated, as were several cabinet ministers. The violence reached a climax in 1936, when fanatical officers staged a revolt. Soldiers broke into the houses of ministers and officials. Several were murdered before the government, backed by the emperor and the navy, restored an uneasy peace.
This cabinet in Tokyo has fallen victim to an attempt to seize power by a section of the Japanese army. Admiral Okada, the prime minister, was shot by assassins who forcibly entered his home. The veteran Count Saito was also shot. In these tragic circumstances, the recent speech by his son, Ambassador Saito, has a dramatic significance.
Japan is a spoiled child who may go astray any moment, who may run amok at the slightest provocation.
The one source of stability in Japan was the emperor, Hirohito. The first of the emperors had begun his reign in 660 BC. He and his successors were believed to be Arahitogami, human and at the same time a god. Hirohito was a slight and timid figure, but all the warring factions owed him allegiance, and emperor worship was central to the life of his people.
Every school had to have a special little shrine called a Huanden, where the photographs of the emperor and empress had to be kept, together with a copy of the imperial rescript. Every time we passed in front of this little shrine, we had to perform a deep bow. There were different degrees of bowing, from the lighter to the deeper, according to the occasion. But when it came to anything to do with the emperor and his family, we had to lower our heads by 45 degrees. When we looked in the direction of the photographs, we weren't supposed to look at them directly. We had to bow so deeply and so long that if we wanted to see the photographs themselves, our only chance was to roll our eyes upwards very briefly. I remember when I was 5 years old, the emperor came and visited a military exercise in Hokkaido. A week before the emperor's visit, the police went around every household, ordering any invalid lying in an upstairs room to come down to the ground floor. They said no one should be on a higher level than the emperor.
The emperor's constitutional position was hedged about with ambiguities, but no one has ever denied that if he had cared to command, all Japan would have obeyed. After the war, Hirohito was made to renounce his godly status. But up to his death, his hold on the affections of his people was as strong as it had been in his days as the divine ruler of Japan. By 1936, a rearmed and bellicose Japan had occupied much of China to the north of the Great Wall. It was time to develop relations with the expansionist powers in Europe.
Il patto tripartito anticomunista
The Anti-Comintern Pact with Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany was designed to protect its signatories from the Soviet Union. It was the first treaty between Japan and the Axis powers. For Japan, intent on expanding into China, it was some insurance against interference from the Russians. In Manchuria, the quality of iron ore and coal was poor, and the pressure to expand further was compelling. On July the 7th, 1937, a restless Japanese army turned a trivial incident into another opportunity for conquest. Several companies of Japanese infantry were training at night by the Marco Polo Bridge near Peking. They were divided into groups, one representing an imaginary enemy. At 10:30 p.m., the exercise had just ended.
Within a minute, 2 or 3 shots came whizzing over our heads. These were shots from the Chinese soldiers on the embankment. You can generally tell the difference between blank and live ammunition. When it was fired, it made a bang and came straight over our heads, and we could hear the sound of it landing. Staff Sergeant Iwaya told the battalion commander what was going on, and the commander immediately ordered a muster. By this time, it was beginning to get light. 8th Company was ordered to advance again as far as Ryobyo, the place where they'd been the night before. When we got to the bridge, an enemy officer appeared and shouted, "Stop!" One of our officers went over to speak to him. "We've been ordered here as we were yesterday," he said. The Chinese officer said, "No way," and returned to his men. As soon as he got back, the Chinese started firing at us. I was the commander of the 3rd Light Machine Gun Platoon, and I'd already seen plenty of action. So I took a machine gun from a soldier and blazed away at the enemy, forcing them to pull back.